Hello everyone, today we talk about the Great Ottoman Fear. For the Europeans, in perspective though, it's a bit as an introduction of the series we make for the 1683 siege of Vienna that we take from very far as in fact as the Ottoman victories over the Serbians and the Byzantines, right? That surely had struck, right, this great fear. It's an important historiographical topic of the Europeans, right? Starting at least since the end of the 14th century. We made videos about this actually. You know that the Ottomans set foot actually in the Balkans in Europe for the first time in the 13th century, right? So they swarm eventually into the Balkans already by the late 14th. There is the Battle of Kosovo-Polia. There is the gradual surrounding of Constantinople, right, and the consequent Crusades that the West did launch, right? When you say that, the Westerners didn't quite contribute to the defense of Constantinople, well, it is true. We made videos also on this. We have showed how actually the rise of the Ottomans as a major regional power stretching across 3 continents actually was preventable even up to the early 15th century, right? Even up to the 30s, basically, and that's just a series of let's say a combination of factors that were surely wanted also by the Westerners, brought to, for example, their reinforcement. That, famously enough, the civil war followed among the Ottomans. I mean, after the defeat of Ankara, was actually put to an end to compact the Ottomans at that point in the political balance by the Knights of Rhodes, by the same Crusaders, by the Venetians, and that's not very seen in perspective. So there was nothing deterministic about, I would say, about the fall of Constantinople too. That is often said. It was just a time, then eventually, the Timurids prevented from the Ottomans to expand, that just belated the fall of Constantinople. That is true, but it's not true that the Ottomans should have come back on their feet so easily as we think. And that's why we'll talk about that in perspective. Today we don't focus so much on the Balkans, but actually on the West, and how the broader relations with the Ottoman Empire were actually much more complex than is usually thought, right? And I make this specific series exactly to show how much this contrast between East and West was actually it's an hypocritical depiction of an historical reality that at this point in time we know pretty damn well at a macroscopical level, and that had indeed to do with Ottoman expansionism that was surely quite dangerous for the West, but also with a lot of good coexistence. The same Westerners brought also strengthening actually Ottoman action against each other, right? And that is so easy if you just know, I don't know, the history of Austria or Hungary or the Italian states or France, more famous. I mean, we keep seeing it even in the Prince Eugen series, and this went on for centuries. So definitely, as we often say, what we call, in a narrow sense, Western European and modern Europe is actually defined by the relation with the Ottomans. That is to say, there wouldn't be that proper conception if the Ottomans had not threatened. You had not occupied large areas of Europe, hadn't threatened to expand further, and hadn't carved this different European identity compared to, to what would have happened if it had remained just like in medieval times, where basically Europe was unthreatened, right, by anybody since the 11th century, fundamentally, just for this flashy Mongolian invasion that, as embarrassingly devastating as it was on European armies, also, however, came back never at least, in the Far East, in Russia, it never kept threatening or remaining as a presence. So, you see that the victories that the Ottomans scored in Anatolia and in the Balkan Peninsula had, since, as we were saying before, the late 14th century, perspective, right, and made fear concretely the possible swarming into Europe, into the heart of Europe. And after the defeat of Nicopolis in 1396, when an imposing crusading army had been literally destroyed and the Byzantine Empire reduced thus to the sole capital into a very striped ring of surrounding territories, Central European powers and the Italians began legitimately to fear a further advance toward their lands, right? And that, in fact, that's pretty much it. That's especially in early modern, in early modern Europe, Central Europe, and the Italian peninsula that are very overlooked in the in catalyzing of that cultural process that we were talking about before, because they were the countries that had the most to do with the Ottomans in this sense, and developing a culture on their own, right, that today is very obscured in the broader conception of what is Western, right, and is often misrepresented or at least instrumentalized, maybe when collected in unpleasant ways, let's say. But that should definitely attract more attention, more focus, and it was, as we were saying before, only the unexpected victory of Timur Lane in 1402 on the Ottoman troops around Ankara that had allowed to breathe a sigh of relief. But things, as you know, had, throughout that process we were saying before, began soon again to fall, up to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, right? Famously enough, May 29, 1453, and then the one of Trebizond in 1461. It would be interesting, as I was saying before, to also focus on how probably the Westerners underestimated Ottoman power, and not so unjustifiably like one would think, because as we were saying before, the predictability of that, it was very in terms of strategic analysis. Don't think that since things happen afterwards and we know that has anything to do with what was really like a sensible option at the time, right? Because history doesn't teach us that at all. And the first power at that point in Western Europe proper to cope with that was definitely Venice, at least by magnitude. That had declared once again, because they had fought, and they were the ones actually that underestimated the Ottomans the most from the top of their naval power, that could have significantly prevented certain Ottoman conquests. The Ottomans initially were much of a land power. They of course, they were expanding on maritime areas, but they wouldn't have a strong fleet on their own. The Venetians were dominating instead, and they were the ones that strategically, at some point, properly underestimated the threat. And they paid with this new war declared by Venice itself, actually, to the Ottomans in 1463. And more, though, because through the Balkans, the Ottomans began to launch raids very far, right? They wouldn't have much of a strategic significance, but in psychological terms, that of course has a strategical impact, etc. The idea of Ottoman incursions reaching so far as places like Carniola, for example, and to swarming in Friuli, right, were a pretty important spy signal, right? That's the point of connection, as we were saying before, between Central Europe and Italy, by the way. So was also an area from which the Ottoman action could depart into various directions. In fact, these were led by the Bosnian horse raiders, the Akinci, right? That from Carniola properly reached Friuli, the plains of Friuli in Italy, and managed to invest territory up to cities like Mestre and Treviso. The Carniola, as you know, is there would be Carinthia and Carniola that today correspond roughly to Slovenia, right? Carniola in Slovenian is Kraniska, I believe, in German Krain, and it coincides with the Upper Sava course, let's say, river course, and it doesn't have to be confused with Carnia either. That is instead comprehended today in the Italian region of Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and corresponding to the mountain basin of the Tagliamento River up to the confluence with the Fella River. And it was thus, let's say, different waves, let's say, between 1469 and 1478, eventually again in 1479, and again after the peace of that year signed between Venice and the Great Lord, the Sultan of Constantinople, it was called at the time, in 1499. The title of Great Lord is interesting because the expression Gran Signore, right, or Gran Turco, it was pronounced or written in Italian independently from the country where it was spoken, right? Basically all over Europe, that Italian culture dominated Europe in the early modern times. So in every country there was this title, the Great Lord, the Great Turk, right? That between the 16th to the 17th century indicated the Padishah, that is properly the Ottoman Sultan, and so it was called the Great Lord. Imagine it, but because what it means for Europeans, the term Lord, right? It's at that time that is fundamentally a princely Europe that is consolidating finally into something more, state-like. The Ottoman Empire, as it's described by Machiavelli, for example, it's something huge in terms of not just properly of territorial extension, but of centralization, military capacity, of course. So this idea of lordship was so seen in such, an impressive scale among the Ottomans that, as you know, for anybody who has studied Renaissance literature, as a sort of a trope of topos of enormous power. Right, and this is quite important also because still to this day, and our historiographical acquisitions, fundamentally most of what we know about the Ottoman Empire in insight is fundamentally through the, through Western literature, right? It's mostly through Western Europeans, Italians, French, Germans, etc., that went there, and as we will see now, very often actually, and made a lot of business actually with the same Ottomans, and told stories that are definitely quite impressive, and that probably they have still to be rewritten in a sense on the base of what today Turkish or Balkan historiographies are gradually bringing to the fore from their own perspective that naturally, was their own in the Ottoman Empire. So these raids in northeastern Italy were quite impressive, as you understand. The Venetian mercenary detachments basically liquefied at the arrival of these raiders. The people enclosed into fortified centers or simply fled into the wilderness. And the same Venetians from the top of St. Mark bell tower could see at night the reverber of the flames that burned the Friulan land. And in the meanwhile, on the opposite end of what was known as the Gulf of Venice, given the power of the Republic, but that we know as the Adriatic Sea, was consumed the famous massacre of Otranto of 1480. Right? You know what happened? Basically, the Ottomans literally invaded Apulia, with actually the intention to carry further. This is not to be treated as a sort of temporary raid, right? They set foot in some cities, and eventually the Neapolitans managed to oust him, to kick him out, but it was conceived as a large-scale operation of invasion. And so that also from all Italy there was a tour of terror for this. Was perceived as the greatest threat, danger for Christianity, and the fact that they were fearing to all fall into the hands of the infidels, literally, as some chronicles say. And many were the voices that thus rose again to call, to implore, to exact an avenging and liberating crusade. Because at the end of the day, Europeans had not abandoned their usual medieval object of actually taking Jerusalem back, right, and Constantinople the same way. And still, crusades were pretty recent things. Think about the same ones in the Balkans that had occurred. Think about Varna in 1444, or the other. Think about Skanderbeg or the Dionyadi, etc., and all the efforts that Balkan powers made to escape in vain. At the end of the day, Ottoman invasion. The papacy had invested a great amount of resources. Western helps, even in there, had arrived, and those operations too had showed that the tides could still be reversed in a sense. Always remember this: there is no such a thing like an unwinnable power. All these states, monarchies, principalities, whatever you find here, empires, were always, let's say, on the brink of collapse, right? Properly from a political, territorial point of view. We're talking about pre-industrial times. There is not that firm territorial grip on the community. And the thing floats on a very unstable and always perturbed base of movements that were very difficult to control. But on the tragic facts of Otranto, there is also the mortgage, actually, a possible combine excogitated by the same Venetians and the Florentines, actually, to come out of the embarrassment of a war against the papacy and the King of Naples, unleashed in 1478. Right, and that was not going well for them. So yes, the same Venice and Florence quite likely had looked at the Ottomans as a relief force to curb their same Italian enemies in the peninsula. In fact, the Sultan would have thus created, on their instance, scandalous and bloody diversive, in order to procure, in the name of the clash against the infidel barbarian, peace among Christians, and therefore taking them out of the impasse. And this is actually realistic, meaning that, of course, the Turks wanted to conquer Italy, and that is something that went on in general, also because of think about Malta, right? And at that point, later on, it would have been essentially the base for launching an offensive in the Italian peninsula. The objective of the Ottomans was obviously to conquer Rome at some point, and that was also realistic. That there was some possibility for it to happen in the worst case scenario, let's say, from the Christian point of view. But the connections, especially with Venice and Florence and the Ottomans, are quite fascinating, because you see, in 1479, so the year before Otranto, there was an Ottoman embassy sent to Venice, together with the that had, let's say, together with the task of actually negotiating peace between the Sultan and the Republic. Also, they want to find to invite, actually, in Constantinople, not just an architect, a bronze melter, a clock worker, a glass worker of Murano, right near Venice, and even a painter, right, capable of actually portraying the same appearance of the Great Lord, in spite of the Quranic prohibition, to depict living beings. And the Venetian government sent on the Bosphorus the best they had, Gentile Bellini, one of the greatest artists of his time, that portrayed the Sultan that was, gently posing for him while the Turk was actually massacring the Christians in Otranto, right? And it is also seemingly true that Mehmet had asked Bellini to paint for him also a portrait of the Virgin Mary that would look better than the Greek icons that he didn't like much, right? And well, there is sure a difference at that point between Orthodox kind of still medieval art and the Italian Renaissance. That's a paradox again, because as we were saying before, Islam prohibits the images of living creatures, right? But it is also tenderly devoted to the Virgin. And for that matter, there are lots of other westernizing things that the Ottoman sultans made that appeared as scandalous, to the same Muslims in their dominions. Also, the peace of 1479, however, would cost to Venice the loss of the island of Negroponte, that is Euboea, and of Albania, where the Venetians had, occupied many strongholds. And after all, this was necessary because in this moment, the Venetian Republic that was allied with Florence, as we were saying before, was facing the Pope and the King of Naples in the war that had broke out as a consequence of the Pazzi plot in Florence of 1478, right? That had killed Giuliano de' Medici and almost risked to kill Lorenzo. That for that reason, was accused actually to have killed himself, a cardinal, in the retaliation. And behind the plot there were naturally the papacy, others, and so you understand at that point what was the strategic significance of an Ottoman attack in southern Italy. So the suspicions are fair, right, that the Venetians had something to do from under the diplomatic point of view with the Turk at Otranto, also because Venice was, in that sense, as we've seen through the sea, the most privileged interlocutor in Europe with the Ottomans. And the same suspicion is valid for the Florentines, because in 1477 the voice had circulated that the Turkish raids in Friuli had been somewhat facilitated also by the Habsburgs and the Count of Görlitz to actually cause difficulties to Venice, right? So the Habsburgs also wouldn't actually, mind very much to employ the Ottomans to fight against other Christian powers. And so at the end of the day, the Turk is always the enemy, right? But of course it is, but enemy of whom? Exactly, because that's real politics, that's real history, not the the bullshit of the clash of cultures, of civilizations, of the wars of religion. These people didn't give a freaking damn about that when they had to save their own skins, and that's how it's always been, always was, it always will, right? And that's the same thing exactly that happens today. I mean, look at the international situation right now. How many cases of that kind you can find easily from a political point of view? And let's say that a certain equilibrium, a certain balance, or sort of truce, better, had been settling after 1481, right? That is the death of Mehmet II Al-Fatih, that is the conqueror, right? That had conquered the golden apple, Constantinople, the great prize, and that had naturally this legacy also to live on till that, and also one of his successors. And and also because the new Sultan, Bayezid II Bali, that is instead the saint, was worried internally because of his brother Jem. It has different spells, but it's like, I think even in modern Turkish it's like the suite G, right? Because it's found in sources like with C, or for example, in English it's gem with J, in French gem with the J, but whatever, it's probably gem, even for the time. And why? Because you see, the sultans had a great deal of succession problems. That was a weak spot of the Ottoman political institutional system, because basically every time the sultan died, there was a sort of race from the various timars around, especially the ones of, say the one of trade, the ones close to Constantinople, to literally sit for first physically on the throne and secure the palace and the city government. So normally in this process, sultans exterminated their own brothers, and Jem instead had managed to escape and to take refuge in the West, right? And he did well, because surely he would have been killed for if he had stayed, or at least it would have been a showdown, and that wasn't looking favorable for him. And he had first fled among the Knights of Rhodes, eventually to the King of France, and even the Pope. In fact, Bayezid had repeatedly attempted to have him killed, but at a certain time he paid himself to his, guardians, a pension, literally, of 40,000 Venetian ducats to keep him at bay, right? So always attempting to send some assassin or something like that, but still also securing, this income to their keepers, so that they would kind of keep him like still as a host, really a prisoner in practice. And in fact, his Christian hosts, on from their point of view, had treated him like a luxury hostage, and also as a sort of object of blackmail, fundamentally. But in the February 1495, the unfortunate prince that at that moment was in Naples, together with the French king Charles VIII, that was preparing his crusade that would never be launched. Charles VIII was obsessed with that. The Wars of Italy technically started, aside from all the dynastic problems of Milan and Naples, etc. Charles wanted to seize these Italian lands to allegedly launch the crusade again, to retake Jerusalem, right? That was still the horizon. So Jem died, right? And it seems, by the way, for natural causes. And the Sultan, at that point, free from the nightmare of seeing his brother contraposed to him on his own lands as legitimate sovereign, supported by Christian powers, had come back on the offensive, well decided also to vindicate of this blackmail the Westerners had enacted through his siblings. So at that point, the stronghold of Lepanto, that is, now Pactus at the mouth of the Corinth Gulf, had been conquered by the Ottomans. Wu, in the meanwhile, had also organized further diversionary actions in Friuli and in Dalmatia. And there is a particularly famous one, the one of the end of September and the 1st of October of 1499, when something like 10,000 raiders, at the orders of Iskandar, that was the Sanjak Bey of Bosnia, that was in turn a renegade originary of the Genoese colony of Pera, the Galata, the famous quarter north of Constantinople across the Golden Horn, went down on the countryside near Gorizia, raiding, burning, and cutting hundreds of heads that they placed then on pikes to terrorize the assaulted. And the result of the raid that lasted 1 week were harvests and forests set on fire, 132 destroyed villages, and roughly 10,000 among dead and prisoners. And the consequences of such invasion were long-lasting, right? It brought to many years of hunger and disorder. In these lands, astonishingly impoverished, right? This is the point, right? Just think of what it means to lay waste an entire countryside in the 16th century, right? It's not like today. You rebuild, right? You restart to send some funds. No, if you raise a freaking place to the ground, that thing is not going to, it's remaining for generations. Unproductive. And in fact, these lands rebelled at some point to the very heavy tax burden of the Venetians, and the local feudal houses also rose their heads up to carrying out actually an episode of mass the massacre in Udine during the Carnival of 1511. So the Venetian Republic had done a lot to fortify the area. However, Leonardo da Vinci, that had inspected in 1500 the fortresses of Gradisca and Fogliano himself, had judged such defense inferior to the needs, right? And there is a nice anecdote about Leonardo and Michelangelo as well, because in 1502, Leonardo in 1502, Michelangelo in 1506, received themselves from the Sultan of Constantinople the invitation to come to him, his palace, and to put themselves at his service. And actually the two welcomed this request with interest, and they almost actually accepted, even though they wouldn't do anything about that in the end. But still, it was ideally like, what do you do? Yes, it's normal. There is a big power overseas. It could have been Turkey, could have been France, right? They wouldn't mind, right? You know that Leonardo eventually went over to it was kind of normal in this business. We will talk about this, right? Because this was happening all over the place. There were tons of Europeans actually going to live in the Ottoman Empire, for that matter. Some even converting to Judaism, for that matter, because it was very, very advantageous. And many Jews, in fact, also fleeing Christian Europe, including some great. There were some Dutch Jewish heiresses, for example, the Charles V at some point, was always on their tracks to prevent them to leave the Netherlands and to go to Constantinople. They managed to cross over through Venice, by the way, because that was always the gate to the east. But we have lots of accounts, including Venetian merchants that converted to Judaism, settled in Constantinople, and wrote. We have their letters writing to their wives in Venice, saying, come here, it's fantastic. This is the reality of that, and it goes so level. I don't think that it's kind of obvious. We will cover in another videos that what are the Turks actually, because here we're talking about half of them were Europeans, like they were Balkan people. And some of them made their own living and fortune. This is not a thing to say that this was such a good thing for the Balkans that lived hundreds of years of ferocious oppression. But hey, ferocious oppression at the time was pretty much on conquered foreign lands everywhere. So at that point it was better to join in the bosses, right? And that always happened in the same ways. This is present. We made videos already actually about some, the fortunes of some slaves. Actually, the overwhelming had a pretty, disgusting life, but some of them maybe rose to become even empresses, sultans' wives, who have seen them. Made a video specifically of that, on the sultanate of women. There is a historiographical term to properly stress at some point also the political weight that these technically slaves, as sultans' wives, actually had in coming to rule the Ottoman Empire themselves, for that matter. And so, aside from this, there was, however, still in all this literally a Turkish obsession that was not just about Venice or the Adriatic, because between the 15th and the 16th century, there was a great production of pronostics, of vaticines that had to do with the Turk, right, and his relation with the Antichrist and the end of times. And in Friuli, as we've seen, this area was tormented by incursions. Lived the learned Girolamo Amaseo, who in 1499 published, had published by the Venetian Manuzio a work titled Vaticinium quo predicitur universum orbem terrarum Christiane religionis imperium subiturum, dedicated to Accours Meunier, that was the French ambassador in Venice, and here was the prediction of a future conquest of the Ottoman Empire and of Asia from the side of the French and the Venetians united, while Ferdinand of Aragon from Spain would have subdued Africa, and a new, quote, aurea proles, right? So new golden children would have spread across the world. And there was some inspiration here because, for example, Louis XII of France had launched an expedition against the Turks who occupied the Aegean island of Mytilene. That is also an interesting thing. In fact, also the brother of Girolamo, Gregorio, had the possibility of presenting this same work, the Vaticinium, to the King of France in person in Milan. And in 1500, Pope Alexander VI Borgia had launched, on occasion of the Jubilee, an appeal for the essentially a full-blown crusade, fundamentally, that had been readily welcomed both by the King of France and the Republic of St. Mark. And Julius II would think something that too, even though he had preferred eventually to organize a Holy League, yes, definitely Holy League, but against Venice, as you know. And on that occasion, actually, and not even so strangely at that point, if you think about it, some Venetian senators had proposed to call the Turks in Italy as allies, because, everybody against Venice, you have to find somebody who's going to fight for that. Naturally, the thing wouldn't happen. And definitely the Holy League against Venice was a somewhat scandalous novelty, because the juridical thought of crusade, not less than the spread feeling of Holy League specifically, was specifically a synonym of crusade, right? So once proclaimed a Holy League, the arms between Christians would have had to immediately go silent, right? Penalty, the disconfession of the crusade as opus pacis, so that is properly to make to pacify against the external threat and pacify internally, right? So, on the other hand, the Holy See could in turn use exactly the arms of canonic law to recall the discipline that since the 13th century had been the one of the so-called crux cismarina, the crux contra Christianos. That is, in fact, the mali cristiani, right? So the bad Christians that would use, with their evil way of acting, would fundamentally prevent or belay, among other things, the moment of the recovery of the holy city of Jerusalem to Christianity, that remained naturally the ultimate end of any crusade, and was and these people were indicated in fact as worse than the Saracens, literally. So that's the same thing that had brought to, this was not actually against heretics proper, but almost, right? The idea that if somebody's rowing backwards, and as Venice was, as we've seen so ambiguously, connected to the Ottomans in a way or in another, but for reasons of realpolitik that, were not less even the ones that our powers had been doing at that point. It's something. So the formidable, the fearful League of Cambrai that was stipulated against Venice at the end of 1508 between Pope Julius II, Louis XII of France, and the Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg, together also with Ferdinand of Aragon, so basically everybody, all the giants against Venice. And the war that had followed had been, in fact, for Venice a very hard lesson, because, famously enough, the Venetians were defeated at Agnadello in May 1509, and the Republic was on its knees, fundamentally, and had managed to come out of it alive, literally, thanks to its diplomacy, after having, again, actually thought of taking into consideration an agreement with Sultan Selim the first at that point, because it was risking to be wiped out, and a diplomacy that had restored to the papacy the Romagnol cities occupied by the Republic, and that had managed to convince the pontiff of the peril at that point constituted by the excessive force thus reached by France. That surely was, as we've seen, Venice was really a superpower for European standards. So, knocking that out, also the political balance of Europe had, shifted in favor fundamentally of France. It was the strongest power, actually, at that point. After that, as a unitary one, right? Because not even Spain was technically, in spite of the dynastic union, one thing. The kingdoms had remained still as two separated things. It would remain up to the late modern age. But after that episode, it was understood that the principal problem was for Venice to possess pacifically the dominion, as they used to say. They used to say Venice would reduce fundamentally to the end of its existence in Napoleonic times to a sort of defensive formula that wouldn't never leave, that would fundamentally renounce to further territorial acquisitions that had been fundamentally started since the 14th and 15th century against the traditional maritime interests of the Republic that would just occupy ports, etc. But, with Italy, they had tried to take over. The other day we were making that video about the Battle of Molinella that was actually one of those attempts for, stemmed from it. And a defensive formula that was based on a precise triad constituted by the fleet, the fortresses, and of the so-called militias, the backbone of which were the artisans of the Bombardieri Corps, right, there were 600 only in Venice, and the peasants of the Cernide, that in Dalmatia, in the Dalmatian possessions of Venice, were known as Kraine. It's like, the frontier area, fundamentally. It's like Ukraine, right? It's like the Kraine in between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans themselves, and in Slav. And the latter people that the one of the Czerny that were something like 35,000 men were, however, inexperienced in the crafts of arms. They were literally militiamen, and therefore Venice was ready, in case of need, to essentially mobilize a reserve force for professional military corps. And this is important because that need of mobilization entailed also a structure behind the possibility of having professionals in its service. And Venice could afford that point. So also the importance given to the works of fortification proved by itself that Venice felt itself very insecure, and that at that point its strategic choice was mostly turned to defense, right? And this formula of tripartite defense that was particularly fitting to the smaller states that at this point could defend themselves from some colossus such as the Empire, France, Spain, and the Sultanate, right? And that would be in fact the model throughout all the 16th century, from the Tuscany of Cosimo I to the Savoy of Emmanuel Philibert. So the matter of the Friulan defenses, for example, would have been kept being discussed throughout all the 16th century, right up to the spectacular urbanistic solution of Palma, today Palma Nova, that was founded in 1593, and exactly on October the 7th, that is 22 years later, after the Battle of Lepanto, right, in honor of the Christian victory. And it has this famous star, very beautiful star structure with 9 points, and in its realization was concentrated the long fortification experience that had been already realized with Zara, Corfu, Candia, Nicosia, right? That the Venetians had built and had conceived first and foremost in function to the necessity to confront the Turk. And the following year, the foundation of Palma in 1594, the Neoplatonic philosopher Francesco Patrizzi, native of the Dalmatian island of Khersa, but lived for a long time in Cyprus, published kind of a disturbing book that known as the Paralleli Militari, that was all centered on the danger of the Turk at the gates. And the contemporary fortification of Salento, by the way, so basically the same area of Otranto, that was the gate and bulwark of the Western Adriatic, that was built in fact after the devastating facts occurred in 1480, responded also punctually to that of the Istrian Dalmatian Friulan area, right? Because the Venetians would also have these strongholds along the Neapolitan coast at some point, and it was part of their policy as a broader, defense of the Strait of Otranto. That was the only way through which Venice was connected to the Mediterranean. And however, maybe the true turning point in the, at least in the Near Eastern event, but as a consequence also in the European and Mediterranean ones, was the one impressed by a battle. That is, yes, we as you know, we are a military history channel, so when people speak of this 12th battalion as, devaluated and all these things, well, of course we know what Bloch and Bogodel Les Annales said about that, but it's kind of obvious. That is, you can never detach two things, right? Doesn't mean that we don't have to study battles anymore, because this seems to be, how the asinine historiographical trend in continental Europe fundamentally has become. But something is coming back, and in fact, coming back to the idea that, things changed a big deal on August the 23rd, 1514. When the Ottoman army of Selim I, that had been at war since the previous March against Safavid Persia of the Shah Ismail I, defeated the Persian army itself in the Battle of Caldera. This was fought in 2 days of march north of the Tigris River, close to the river Bendimai, that also throws itself into the Van Lake. And that news about the battle had indeed a great impact in Europe itself. For example, scholars of the caliber of Francesco Guicciardini and Paulus Jovius talked about them. The latter especially informs us that Pope Leo X, at the announcement of the Safavid defeat, was shocked, right? Because everybody knew what that meant, right? So much that he sent immediately, the following November the 3rd, letters to the Apostolic Nunci of Spain, France, and Portugal, and also to the Swiss cantons, to Genoese and the Florentines, right? And he was worried, legitimately, that the Sultan, definitely now freed of this eastern incumbents on the Persian front, would now turn directly to the west. And he was right. And in fact, Selim, feeling evidently safe in his Persian flank, attacked in 1516 the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and in a couple of years it eliminated it, swallowing its enormous territories, stretching from Syria to the Sirte Gulf, right, and down to the Red Sea, up to the straits between Africa and Arabia. Since the April of that year, the pontiff had published a true and proper bull of crusade against the Sultan that, in a short while, would have extended his direct dominion on Jerusalem and would have strictly connected himself with all, let's say, those princes Corsair, let's say, of Muslim rulers of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algeria, who at least formally had accepted Ottoman sovereignty. And there is obviously a difference between the Corsair and pirate and whatever, but we will talk about that on another occasion. We actually made a video on the conquest of Tunis, right, that explains, at least in part, the issue. And in the papal document, Selim was defined lupus ille rapax turcus, immanissimus Christiani nominis hostis, which means literally, that rapacious Turkish wolf, right, the most immense enemy of the Christians by name, right, and surely was an important political substance in these ideas. And aside, let's say, the political convenience, however, and rhetorical expressions, in fact, there is no doubt that the fear that the Ottomans struck were true and real, right? And together with the growing interest towards them by all the European peoples, because the thing is, what the hell are these guys? Like, after a short while before, yes, they had been, everybody knew Constantinople had fallen because of them, whatever, but now they have kind of, swallowed the whole freaking Eastern Mediterranean. And, literally, who are these guys? Hence the interest of Western literature on them. In fact, it's been calculated that between the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 17th, let's say, for one book written on the American continent, 2 books were written on the Turks, right? Literally, because that tells you how impacting the Ottoman threat was perceived, so much that, the discovery of the Americas was a big deal still. It was even a sort of cultural shock for Europeans. They had to redraw much of their worldview, in a sense, that they had to face with other people. It was also kind of a natural, fluid thing, but still the interest towards the Ottomans was double the one towards the newfound land, right? And this also has naturally deep connections with the true and single most important event of the time for Europeans. That is not the Turks, it's not the Americas, but it's of course the Reformation. Right, that is the single most traumatic event that happened in that moment. Right, Europeans were polarized about that, on that, and only on that. Right, and this was all, of course, the sales for indulgence, and so, the protest against it. And therefore, and that was connected with the Turks because of also the reglementation of the law of crusade is financing and the relation with the indulgence, right? And this doesn't have to be underestimated as a factor of the Reformation, because if the Ottomans had not presented this major threat, the papacy would have not asked so much money to Christendom, and the financial pressure on these communities would have been less, and maybe easily different political and religious trends would have taken place, right? And we would know also a different Europe. So today, but yeah, and then at some point we will talk about who are the Turks, too, because the question is, again, we say the Turk, whatever with it, but at this point the Turks are, the Turks, the Balkans, the Egyptians, the Syrians, a lot of peoples, the Greeks. You see, that's what we're talking about. That's a part of Europe, telling the truth, and that's what is rarely properly addressed as a otherwise macroscopical reality that should always be at the center of every single, even presumption of debate on what was the clash between the Ottomans and Western Europe, because it was very far from being, as we've seen just from this video, anything like cleanly, neatly said, divided in a dichotomy, dividable in a dichotomy, and yeah. But anyhow, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.